Director of the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative. We are one of the co-organizers of this side event together with ICIMOD, from which we have Isabella Gaziel, who will speak later, as well as SCAR, the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, who are a co-organizer but unable to be here today. We also, as ICCI, serve as the secretariat of the new Ambition on Melting Ice high-level group on mountain water resources and sea level rise. And we will be speaking today about a pre-sessional workshop. I'll be summarizing some of the scientific findings from that workshop in a first presentation. We made the calculated decision to have a lot of negotiators here at the table, which means they may be pulled away. I am still expecting one of the co-chairs of AMI, Eduardo Silva from Chile, to come and at some point open or at least address the group, but we're going to go ahead without him. Joanna Post of the Secretariat is scheduled to be here, and hopefully she will also come. We've already had regrets from Iceland, our other co-chair, Helga Bardadottir. So as I said, we'll simply have to be flexible. It's great to have actual negotiators on a panel, but it also means that sometimes they can disappear. So we're going to be quite flexible with the program schedule that you see online. So with that, I think I'm simply going to go ahead and start into a summary of the science. And the reason it was felt by AMI that it was important to do some sort of pre-sessional, even though this was not a mandated event, there was in the cover language from COP27 a strong reference to the need to better understand cryosphere and tipping points and implications for ambition in particular. And cryosphere science is very difficult to do. It requires very strong modeling computers, and as a result, back in 2015, there was a lot that was still emerging or not very well understood when the Paris Agreement was negotiated. And it is the conviction of, I would say, virtually all cryosphere scientists at this point in time that based on what we know today, the 2 degrees limit is too high. Ice responds at a lower temperature and more quickly than we realized until quite recently. And it's important for governments in particular, as well as civil society, to be aware of this emerging science, be aware of how quickly it is moving. And so one of the things that we're hoping to accomplish by COP28 is that these updates from the cryosphere science community perhaps become a mandated pre-sessional kind of event every other year or so that the governments and civil society and others can keep up on these developments, because there really are rather extreme implications for some of this emerging science. And I'm just going to touch over just a few of the things that came out of the update from cryosphere science for parties at this pre-sessional workshop that took place on June 2nd. So these are the more important cryosphere thresholds. Ice sheets, of course, sea level rise. Mountain glaciers and snow have significant impacts on water resources as well as disasters as they melt. Permafrost has emissions today of around 0.5 gigatons a year, but could be as much as 10 gigatons a year with high emissions, and these emissions continue for a couple of centuries. And so this is also then an issue of intergenerational justice, because these emissions are going to have to be offset by future generations, even if anthropogenic emissions are down to 0. Polar ocean acidification, especially in the Southern Ocean, was set as a kind of a limit already in 2008 at 450 ppm. We're currently going up 2.5 ppm a year, have been for the past 25 years. If you do the math, that means we're going to hit that 450 level in 11 years. And Arctic sea ice, research shows that total loss will occur some summers in 1.5 degrees C. It will be an annual event by 1.7. By 2 degrees, the ice-free period will stretch from July to October most years. And I'm going to go over some of these very briefly, but all of these largely depend on peak temperature, not that you go up and you come down again, and whatever that new stable temperature is, ice responds mostly to whatever that peak temperature of warming is, or peak CO2 in the case of polar ocean acidification. All but Arctic sea ice is irreversible for 500 to 2,000 plus years. Acidification actually lasts 50 to 70,000 years, so that's quite permanent, especially on human timescales. And all of these, and this is what's especially new, all of these are well in train, well below 2 degrees C, but they can be slowed or avoided with the very low emissions pathway, SSP1, which has a 1.6 degree peak and is well below 1.5 degrees by the time you get to 2100. So I'm going to run through these really quickly. Here again, this is an AR6 Working Group 1 Summary for Policymakers slide, and if you see that dotted line at the top, which was titled A Low Likelihood, High Impact Storyline, that low likelihood refers not to, is this likely or not? I'm a former diplomat myself, not in terms of the way normal people think. For the IPCC and the scientific community, what that simply means is it was based on 2 studies only. But those 2 studies were seen as so significant that they decided to include this dotted line. What has happened since AR6 closed, so really since January 2021, is that an increasing number of papers have come out that say that that dotted line appears to be correct. And this is from just one of those papers that came out earlier this year, in January, Park et al. And it looks at both ice sheets in conjunction, which was unusual. But it's showing that really only SSP 1.9 with temperatures peaking at 1.6, so this is the blue line in the slides to the left that show cumulative, and then Greenland and Antarctica, will actually be leveling off by the time we hit 2150. The others are still going up, and this even goes for the low emissions pathway, but it's a lot slower. And so, if you can have a take-home, it's that very low is absolutely best, but low is certainly better than the alternatives. And the interesting thing about this study is that it shows that sea level continues to accelerate even after the rate of warming has slowed. So if you look at this to the right on the screen, that red arrow, you can see that even with high emissions, the rate of warming by 2150 is on its way down. But sea level is not responding to that slower rate of warming. It's still going up and will continue to go up. That is an indication of thresholds probably being passed on both Greenland and Antarctica. And that is an important aspect of this. These are permanent. We cannot stop an ice sheet once it really gets going. It's just too big, and it continues to go essentially until all the ice is gone. For mountain glaciers, you have on one side here our current emissions, and this is the Great Aletsch Glacier, the top of the alpine world, at least in Europe and Switzerland. And as you watch this run through with high emissions, that glacier is essentially gone by 2100. That's the case for most mid-latitude glaciers outside the Hindu Kush Himalaya. But with very low emissions, you still have a steep rate of loss, and that's something we can't prevent. All glaciers pretty much worldwide are losing ice very, very quickly, but with very low emissions, they stabilize around the middle or towards the end of the century. We don't see a lot of regrowth, even with very low emissions, except in the Alps, and it takes until about 2300 before you start seeing that regrowth in the very few studies that have gone out that far. And so one of the takeaways is, in a sense, you could say it's very easy to lose glacier ice. It's a lot harder to build it back. It's going to take many, many centuries. So the best way to do it, of course, is not to lose the ice at all, to stay on a very low emissions pathway. And really, there are important water towers that are all around the world. One of the most important, of course, is the HKH region, as well as Central Asia. Some of these river basins actually are 100% glacier or snow-fed. The western U.S., as you can see here with global snowpack, it's 80% of the water supply comes from snowpack. $3 billion for agriculture. The Indus River is 50% of runoff from snowmelt. The Ganges is a lot less, but it's seasonally important. And actually, for most glacier basins, it's that seasonal aspect that's important when it's the dry season. So going back to for example, to Switzerland, you can see that the projections are that you're going to get, actually in some ways, lots more water in the early spring and early summer, because you're going to have a lot of snow falling as rain instead. But then come August, which is when agriculture in Switzerland and many of the surrounding river basins in Northern Europe, there will be no glaciers left, and so they're going to have a water scarcity when they need it the most. Permafrost thaw has lots of feedbacks. It's very complicated. Happy to answer questions on this, but the most important is you get thaw, you get carbon emissions, both methane and CO2, you get warming, and then you get more permafrost thaw. The other aspect of this, again, that's important is that once permafrost thaws, it continues to emit either carbon dioxide or methane for several hundred years, and that will need to be offset then by negative emissions by many generations. And the scale depends on how high we go. So even at 1.5 degrees, emissions for a couple of hundred years will be about the equivalent of India's today. Today, they're already at the level of Japan's, which is about 1 to 1.5 gigatons a year. But if we go up to 2 degrees, we're at the level of committing emissions at the EU today, and then even higher on the scale of a very major emitter such as the US or China. When it comes to polar ocean acidification, this is really not that well known. It's actually technically not cryosphere because by definition open water is not frozen, but we include it because colder waters, to simplify, and if there were a polar ocean acidification expert, they give you a much longer explanation. But you can think that colder waters acidify more quickly. They're absorbing more CO2 than the rest of the world's oceans, but that comes at a cost because they're acidifying faster. And already in the 2000s, we were able to see shell damage, especially in the Southern Ocean. That's now spread to certain parts of the Arctic Ocean. And you can see, it's sort of hard to see in this lower globe, but even with very low emissions, there is some areas above both Russia and above Canada that are not going to be able to support shell-building organisms year-round. But the greater emissions go, the more waters are going to acidify, either seasonally or throughout the year, and that's when other kinds of species can crash as well, such as cod, such as salmon, the krill catch in the Southern Ocean. All of these things are important. Finally, Arctic sea ice loss. There was, again, when I'm saying this is happening quickly, I mean that. There was a study that came out on Tuesday that's gotten a lot of attention that is showing that observations are running well above projections right now, even in AR6. So observations are running above the high-end projections that were in AR6. And again, as I said earlier, it directly follows CO2 and temperature. And we're sort of making a decision as to how much sea ice we lose based on how high temperatures go. But there are multiple dangerous feedbacks from that sea ice loss. One of the, still a little bit controversial, but certainly I think most people feel they're seeing it, is weather extremes, disturbed weather, extended periods of drought or rain when the jet stream gets locked in one position or another. But definitely impacts on Greenland melt, accelerated Greenland melt, more permafrost thaw, and more global warming generally because you've got this dark open water that's absorbing heat and feeding it back into the climate system. So here's a practical example of what this new understanding means. And our colleague Carlos Fuller is from Belize, and so I'm picking, unfortunately, on Belize. With current emissions, this is the state of Belize City already in 2050. That's just 1 meter of sea level rise. But with high emissions, which is where we are right now, this is where it would be in 2050. But with very low emissions, that sea level rise, which may already be inevitable, and we need to be, open and clear about that, but it could be delayed well beyond 2100. So it does make a difference. And here is 3 meters. Again, the cryosphere scientists will say because of warming built into the system, we may be committed to this, but over a period of 1 to 2,000 years. But we could reach this by the early 2100s with current emissions. You see Belize City, that sort of dot poking out from the coastline, and sea levels are reaching about 16 kilometers inland at that point. Belize was very smart to put its capital city well inland, but still Belize City is a major commercial center. So here are some of the takeaways then, that mountain and low-lying countries are impacted sooner and will experience more loss and damage than others, but it's important to also say very low emissions, staying within 1.5, slows some impacts to occur over centuries, and it preserves far greater land mass or habitable regions in the mountains for far longer. Because of new and growing scientific knowledge that cryosphere responds more sensitively, 2 degrees is definitely known today as far too high as the upper Paris limit. And even 1.5 degrees really lies within cryosphere's risk zone. There are error bars, but what people tend to forget is those error bars go down as well as up. And so 1.5 is definitely well within that zone. For example, for total Greenland loss is seen as about 1.6. What if it's 1.5? And of course, there are implications throughout the UNFCCC negotiating tracks, especially loss and damage. Adaptation needs, countries need to know this so they can plan realistically as to what they're going to be looking for, but also to push us towards more urgent mitigation. It's not good enough to overshoot and come back down again, because the cryosphere is going to respond to that peak. And so as a final slide, I want to show COP28 host Dubai. Ironically, the 10 meters, which could occur by 2300, if you look sort of in the center there, and there are 2 blue location dots just below the red, that's the site of COP28. That's the International Conference Center, and it cuts straight through where COP28 will take place. The UAE has a very low-lying coastline, and so it's very, very vulnerable to sea level rise. Where COP28 will take place is fairly well inland, and yet even that will be impacted potentially by 2300. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our keynote speaker, Isabella Koziel, who is the Deputy Director of ICIMOD. She's going to advance her own slides. James, I might need you to. Sorry, I'm a Mac person, not a PC person. I always forget this when I'm at SB meetings. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all. So I'm going to now zoom in on a specific region, the Hindu Kush Himalaya, where we are saying that actually 1.5 is already within our sights, as we've heard from the WMO recently, and that it is already too hot because the impacts are already present, and the potential implications of going to 1.5 and beyond are enormous and will affect us all. So the Hindu Kush Himalaya is a vast region. It covers 8 countries. It's the source of Asia's 10 largest rivers. It has 4 out of 36 global biodiversity hotspots. It's home to 250 million people. It has well over 1,000 languages, and there are up to 3 billion people who rely on this resource. What we say is 2 billion directly, but 3 billion if you count the food that is produced from and irrigated from the waters that flow from the Hindu Kush Himalaya. So let's just pause on those facts. 2 billion to 3 billion people rely on this resource, and yet it is already in crisis. And so what do we see as the problem? What I call now as the quadruple planetary crisis. Of course, we know what the triple planetary crisis is, but sometimes we forget to mention the issue of people within that. So we have this juxtaposition of climate change. We've been monitoring the temperatures, and we know that the HKH warming is higher than the global average. There is something called elevation-dependent warming that occurs at higher altitudes. We have biodiversity loss, we have pollution, and we have large-scale demographic change with rapidly changing socio-economic dynamics. So that's why we're saying 1.5 degrees is too hot. So in terms of what is happening to the cryosphere, as we heard earlier, we have melting glaciers. They are already melting. We have been mapping various glacial lakes in the Hindu Kush Himalaya. We've mapped 1,000 glacial lakes. We know that over 200 of those are potentially dangerous, either because they are the size of the lake or because they are prone to rockfall, or that the moraines that dam them are loosening. But the solutions to these are very difficult. It's not easy to go up to 3,000–4,000 meters and simply drain a lake. These are not easy solutions, and you can imagine what happens when one of these dams breaches. There are hundreds of people who live downstream of these lakes, thousands. And of course, we know that there will be more glacial lake outburst floods. We have these regularly, as regular occurrences in the Hindu Kush Himalaya. And it's not easy for communities to just move, and yet the risks are there and ever present. We heard about permafrost. We have thawing permafrost in the Himalayas. This causes significant ground instability. It disrupts water flows as the ground is less frozen. It has huge effects on biodiversity and ecosystems. We have to note there are large numbers of high-altitude communities that still rely wholly on these ecosystems and the biodiversity within them. And of course, we heard about the greenhouse gas emissions that is likely to happen. And there are, of course, multiple unknowns. And yet, we barely know about what the distribution of permafrost is in the HKH. There's very little monitoring. We have a couple of sites in the HKH, and there are a few others working on this, but we really don't know the scale of the problem. And changing snow, we know that there already is more unpredictable snowfall. The snow melt is more unpredictable. There's fewer days with snow cover. This is data we have already. The snow is wetter, we have more intense snowfall events, and we have changing avalanche patterns. And you can just imagine what the kinds of implications that this may have. So in summary, we have multiple impacts as a result of these changes. Unstable slopes cause landslides. We have large-scale road building in the Hindu Kush Himalaya. This is essential for our communities, and yet a lot of these investments are now under serious risk. We have increasing unpredictability around snow and avalanches. This, of course, puts communities at risk. It puts water supplies at risk. And, of course, it puts tourism at risk. And I think there are already about 20 deaths across at least Nepal this year. Many of them were caused by unpredictable avalanches. Of course, flooding, too much or too little water, is a common occurrence with vast losses as a result. And we must also consider the impacts on all the investments downstream, whether that's urban areas, mountain settlements, hydropower, roads. This is having huge impacts on all those investments being made by those countries in the HKH. And of course, on livelihoods, huge disruptions in terms of agriculture. Our high-altitude pastoralists are increasingly struggling with their traditional lifestyles. There are no other options in these regions. Water supply is dwindling, it's changing, it's increasingly unpredictable. That is having, of course, impacts on domestic supply, on agriculture, and on hydropower. And of course, as we move towards renewables, hydropower is a critical resource for the HKH and the countries that depend on that hydropower. And yet it is at risk. Of course, cultural values are being disruptive as people need to move. Some of those movements are caused by climate change. Of course, there are many other socioeconomic reasons why people move. But the issues around where they move to, their well-being, often the migrants are moving to vulnerable areas and in low-lying altitudes, and there are huge well-being issues that we are not even aware of or looking at. And of course, disasters. And we would just like to flag the potential for an enormous humanitarian impact of the changing cryosphere in the HKH. There are hundreds, thousands, potentially billions of people at risk. I've talked already about the impacts on livelihoods, but we know that 83% of springs will be moving to higher elevations. A lot of our mountain communities depend on these springs. Up to 79% of river flow is likely to be affected. Agricultural losses, and about 120 million farmers depend on water from glacial melt and snow melt to irrigate their crops. What happens when we have these disruptions to these communities? And of course, we are unprepared. There are calls for reducing emissions, to avoid adaptation, so that there is less need for loss and damage, but a lot of these impacts are already prevalent and present. So as we move forwards as well, we know that these risks are increasingly complex, they're cascading, they are interrelated. Just two examples of two major events in 2021. Of course, we all know about the Pakistan floods in 2022. They were also caused by unique atmospheric conditions, but obviously melting glaciers had a secondary contribution. But Chamoli killed 150 people and wiped out the entire hydro development worth billions of dollars. Melamchi destroyed several bridges, brought down 15 meters of sediment, affected the water supply for Kathmandu. Again, huge costs. This happened 2 years ago. So in terms of our response, I come from the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. We have been convened and governed by the 8 countries of the Hindu Kush Himalaya. We are a regional organization. We hold intergovernmental status, and we're a knowledge and learning center. And we exist to serve the 8 countries of the Hindu Kush Himalaya to address some of these enormous challenges. But of course, we are small. We are still a relatively small voice given the enormity of these risks and challenges as we move forwards. So we've created our new strategy to 2030. It's an enormous task that we've laid out on the table for the next 7 years only. So we've called it Moving Mountains, and we're working on 3 streams of work: reducing climate and environment risks to the Hindu Kush Himalaya, whilst acknowledging that we need to help mountain states and mountain communities enhance the livelihoods for those who are still there, but also doing much more at the regional and global level to ensure that there is full awareness and integration of these issues in regional and global policy. So in terms of some of the activities we've been taking forward and will continue to take forward, we've done a lot of in situ and satellite-based measurements. So you've heard about some of the issues that I flagged earlier. But as we move forward, we will be working wholeheartedly to support our regional member countries to strengthen their monitoring capabilities, but also to ensure that they have the kind of risk assessment capabilities moving forward. So to understand the risks of the changing cryosphere on investment, on communities and ecosystems. And finally, we'll be doing far more to coordinate and convene our region to have a collective voice on these issues moving forwards. Of course, not all of our 8 countries hold cryosphere, but some of them are recipients of the downstream impacts of the changing cryosphere. We work on early warning systems. We'll be doing far more on disaster risk reduction, which will include looking at how do we get this information down to communities, down to that last mile, but also moving much more into looking at how we can address these upstream, downstream issues across borders within river basins, whether that's the Indus or the Koshi Basin, but also looking far more also at the issues around loss and damage. In terms of green and inclusive mountain economies, again, our efforts we've been working on this for a very long time, but our efforts are still fairly small. We do create innovations and technologies, and we work with our governments to support our governments to scale these innovations and technologies, or with the IFIs, or with other partners. And here are some examples of the kinds of innovations that we bring in. So for instance, how to cope with erratic snowfall patterns. So this is an image from Misgar village in Hunza in Pakistan, where we're experimenting with farmers on how to grow vegetables in tunnels with solar panels, and how we can scale this technology so that the temperatures are held more evenly within these tunnels so that the farmers can sustain their productivity. We've been also working with farmers on another solution in Pakistan, which is looking at a collective solar irrigation model. Again, farmers can't afford to have their own irrigation system, so this is a collective approach, and yet one would like to ask oneself the question that a farmer can't even afford himself or herself a solar irrigation system, but they have to share these across the communities. And this is largely due to the much more unpredictable weather. So we're also working, as I said earlier, at the regional and global level. In 2019, we brought together a synthesis of research and science to really look at what is happening in the Hindu Kush Himalaya. We have an updated version of that report coming out in the summer, which really again updates the science on the impacts of climate change on water, ice, society, and ecosystems. We've also been working across our region to create what we call the HKH call to action. We've specified what are the 6 urgent actions moving forwards. These have been agreed across our countries. And as we are moving forward, we are working across our region to develop a formal mechanism for cooperation akin to something like the Alpine Convention or the Arctic Council. We're using science policy dialogues to muster and foster the interest in this regional mechanism. We've set up an HKH task force, and there will be a second ministerial meeting later this year to take the next bold step to establish this mechanism for cooperation, which will again strengthen our voice in the region and strengthen the ability to manage this regional public good and attract investment for these mountain countries. And so finally, in conclusion, with regard to the global stocktake, it's striking that cryosphere has not been mentioned as part of this stocktake, given all the data that we've given you over the last 20 minutes. So we are calling for these issues to be taken up in these processes, in these negotiations and discussions that are happening here. There is a real urgent need to integrate mountain and cryosphere issues in all aspects of the GST, the global goal and adaptation, and mitigation. And finally, we've launched a campaign to mark the 70th anniversary of the first successful ascent of Everest. We know that the region has changed dramatically over this time. The iconic Khumbu Glacier on Everest is fast disappearing and almost gone. This is dramatically different to the situation 70 years ago. And if we think that we're saying that by 2100, under current emissions scenarios, 2/3 of those glaciers will be gone, that is almost the same time frame as the first successful ascent of Everest. It's not within my lifetime, but it's certainly within our children's lifetime. I think we need to really pause on that fact and think about the scale and the severity of it. So we have created a declaration. We've collected over 2,000 signatures. We would be very keen for other mountain regions to join this. We want to take this to COP28. We will be translating this and sending it with a Bhutanese delegate, Jamyang, who was actually starred in 7 Years in Tibet when he was a child. He will be taking that together with a bottle of water from the melting glaciers. He's been traveling right across the Hindu Kush Himalaya. We will be taking that to COP28. We would want others to join and sign this declaration. The more voices, the more we can come together to support these issues, the more powerful the voices will be. So finally, let's keep Cryosphere on the global agenda as well, and please do support and sign our declaration. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabella. If I could now ask our AMI co-chair, Chile, to come and preside over the rest of this. We'll have some policy comments from various parties. I also see other interested parties and AMI members in the room. Feel free to take part in these discussions. So Eduardo, if you could come up here. And our first speaker will be Annika Christel from Sweden, and also with the EU, talking about the mitigation work program.
Could you pass me my wood?
Thank you. Should I go ahead, Pam? Yeah? Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm Annika Christel from Sweden, also representing EU. I think I did try to talk about the cryosphere in the global stocktake yesterday, and I think Switzerland did as well. So at least we have gotten it in there. But I do think that not enough people know about the cryosphere research, and I think it's very important that they do, because it is really telling us what we must do, and that is achieving the 1.5 goal. I was asked to talk a little bit about the mitigation work program. I think the link between the cryosphere research and the mitigation work program is probably the sense of urgency, because the mitigation work program was decided on in Glasgow as a way to express the urgency, and also, I guess, to find a space where we can discuss mitigation, because we do have the global stocktake, but that happens every 5 years, and other than that, we don't really have a negotiation space where we can talk about mitigation. And this program is focused on pre-2030. That's also an indicator of the urgency, that we have to do things now before the window of opportunity is closed. So this decade, we have to do a lot. It's focused on ambition and implementation during this critical decade. And I'm hoping that this will be the space where we can talk about mitigation in a constructive way and find solutions and help each other, while the GST is much bigger, as you know, and covers more topics and has also quite a lot of political implications. So what this is about is a focused exchange of views, information and ideas. That's the text in the decision. And we are to have 2 global dialogues each year, and then we can also have other dialogues decided from year to year. We will also have investment-focused events under this program. Every year we will decide on the theme, and we're supposed to have broad thematic areas. And anyone can suggest a theme to the mitigation work program. You do it in the beginning of the year. I think it's before 1st of February. And then the co-chairs of the mitigation work program, which is currently now for 2 years, a French and an Egyptian, they will then decide on the theme for that particular year. So this year we have just energy transition as our theme. Also, I can mention that one of the important things I think with this program is the non-party stakeholder participation. That is something that we have been pressing a lot from the EU side, that if we are going to talk about mitigation and what needs to be happening, then we need to look at the sectors. And who is in the sectors? Well, that's other people, not negotiators. It's people working there, and it's private people as well. So we really want non-party stakeholders getting involved in the mitigation work program. And I think this first dialogue that we have had here in Bonn was quite, I mean, the preparations for it were quite late, so it was difficult to really get the non-party stakeholders involved, but we will certainly try as much as we can to get them involved for the autumn. Also, one of the important things is, of course, the link to the political level. That's also something that we wanted, and we have now in the decision that we will have a CMA decision each year from the mitigation work program, and also a presentation for the high-level ministerial roundtable, which takes place every year also. So there is this link, which I think is very important, and also the link to science, of course. That link is in the paragraph about the themes. So everything should really be based on what the science tells us. There will be a report from each dialogue, which will feed into an annual report, and that is the report that will be presented to the high-level ministerial roundtable. So I think getting the messages and like the key recommendations and whatever we think is useful, depending on the theme, of course. That I think that's how you get your message across in the end from this program. And it will continue until 2026, but it's possible that it will be prolonged. We wanted it until 2030 because we think that there's a lot to do in the mitigation field this decade. I think I'll stop there unless there are any questions on this particular program.
Yeah. I think we'll do questions more towards the end. Okay. Our next speaker, of course, mitigation, next adaptation. Joanna Post has actually long been a friend of both Cryosphere and Oceans and Science, but now very much focused on the Nairobi work program. And so be interested in hearing your reflections. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you for inviting me to the side event. Hi, everyone. Happy World Oceans Day, for those of you who don't know, and particularly white oceans today at this event. I have been, I'm here based with the UNFCCC Secretariat leading the oceans work, but I'm also within the adaptation program leading the Nairobi work program, which is a, if you like, a knowledge broker and deliver deliverer of adaptation knowledge to constituted bodies and parties within our process, and really trying to bring information to support adaptation decision making. But also I wanted to mention adaptation in a bit more of a wider context. We just heard about the mitigation work program. We also have the global goal on adaptation and the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation work program, which is also going on and is sort of at the similar level, if you like, to the mitigation. So I'll touch base on a few of those things. Going back to the origins, the convention itself, it's worth remembering that the ocean and cryosphere, and here, of course, we're talking more about the cryospheres, is hidden in plain sight in the convention. If you go to the 1.3, which is actually the descriptions of all of the different terms, climate system under the convention includes the hydrosphere. So it includes everything to do with the cryosphere. The original convention also talked about protecting ecosystems. Then the Paris Agreement itself uses those same definitions. So again, we're talking about keeping 1.5 alive, as Isabel very clearly elucidated, the massive challenges that come with exceeding that, as well as adapting to what's happening already. So what we are doing here within the Nairobi Work Programme is looking at the adaptation knowledge gaps around different sectoral spaces. Our focus actually moving forward over the next year will be adaptation knowledge gaps around cryosphere, mountains, high latitude areas. So we haven't started yet, I can't talk much about it, but we will be engaging widely with experts to build a scoping of what those adaptation knowledge needs are, and looking at how we can collaborate to deliver knowledge into that space for the benefit of parties. But I think also it's worth mentioning, very briefly, I know there's always time constraints in these side events, I want to flag with you the importance of the global goal and adaptation in the discussions. This year there have already been 5 workshops, 6 workshops, apologies. There will be a 7th one at the end of July, and that one is actually going to be looking at how the work on global goal and adaptation can link with other processes. So I strongly recommend you to keep an eye on that and keep an eye on what's coming out of the conversations around the GGA, because if we are truly talking about global adaptation goals, then there are a lot of things in this party-driven process that parties are out of sight, up mountains, across EEZs, that really need to be considered in these conversations around if collective progress on adaptation includes the whole of our blue planet. So I will stop there. I'm looking forward to collaborating further with ICIMOD and ICI and others when pursuing the work moving forward and looking at some of this knowledge around the adaptation gaps. But there's still, as we see, a lot of work to be done to bring that conversation ultimately into parties' nationally determined contributions, so that that information is recognized, that there needs to be mitigation and in adaptation communications, goals communicated around this space and acted upon and reported upon and built into the global stocktake moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jo. Our next speaker is, we're very honored to have a real legendary negotiator who's been around these rooms for quite a long time. You may not want to say how long. Dr. Carlos Fuller of Belize, and of course loss and damage is hugely consequential as a result of cryosphere collapse. So some reflections from you, please.
Thank you very much, Pam, and I'm not a doctor. So, but I'm glad Joanna spoke about the early part of the convention, because indeed I'll date myself. In the INC process, when AOSIS was negotiating on developing the climate change convention, our big ask at that time was to put in an insurance mechanism to address sea level rise. We recognized that sea level rise was the most significant part of climate change that would affect us. Unfortunately, it did not make it into the convention, except for one word that speaks about 6.8 about talking about insurance, but we never put the insurance mechanism in place. And at that time, in 1992, when we adopted the convention, part of it does say that we expect emissions to return to 1990 levels by the year 2000. Well, obviously, that has not occurred whatsoever. And so we are now faced with these alarming results that we are now seeing. And I say the results are alarming because, yes, we expected sea level rise to affect us. But based on what we're seeing now, with the rapid decline of the cryosphere, with the emission trends right now, we see the results, obviously, for example, like for Belize City, which is, has about 1/4 of the population of the country of Belize, and in fact, 1/2 of Belize's population is along the coastal zone, and so they will be affected. They will have to retreat. And across the Caribbean, it is the same thing. 50% of the population of the Caribbean lives along the coastal zone. That is some 10 million persons who will have to migrate. Across the Pacific, it is even more. So obviously, we're in very serious trouble there. 10% of our agricultural lands will be underwater, and so we're losing that productivity. 16 of our seaports and our airports will be inundated with this level. And obviously, our entire tourism sector will be devastated by it because most of our tourism in the Pacific, in the Caribbean, depends on the coastal zone, on our diving, beaches, and so on. So obviously, we are in a serious threat from sea level rise, both the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean, and in the Pacific. And that then leads us to the area of loss and damage. What do we do with these populations, with the livelihoods that we would have lost? We have one community already in Belize called Monkey River. Up until the 1960s, it was a town. But because of sea level rise and people moving out, it has dwindled to a very small community. They had 100 yards of seafront of beach, which has totally gone. The first 2 rows of houses have collapsed into the sea. The cemetery is now underwater. So obviously, we have to do something with this diminishing population. We will have to move them. And this is where the issue of loss and damage then comes into play right away for us, and by 2050, far more. So at this session of the SBs, we should be looking now at the host the host of the Santiago network on loss and damage, because it is the network that is going to provide us with the solutions to address loss and damage. And so we have to establish the host, and by COP28, actually then select that host, and then they can then begin to put the network together and begin providing support to us. And then secondly, we now need to operationalize the loss and damage financing facility that was established at the last COP. So obviously, we would then need, once we operationalize it, to get the funding necessary to then provide the resources to the network so that we can then get the support to address these issues. So there's a lot of work we need to do in these 6 months to get this thing going, operationalize it, and then address this large population and livelihoods that will be affected. Because at the end of the day, if this is not done now, we already see the mass migration occurring from Africa into Europe, from the Americas, going up into the southern US. It's going to get far worse unless we start to address it right now. So indeed, there's a lot of work for loss and damage we must address in these upcoming 6 months. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Our final speaker, before we move into Q&A and discussion, is going to give us a little bit of a note of hope. Bhutan, at least, is currently a negative emitter and has plans for essentially zero carbon or even negative carbon development. Speaking to this will be Namgai Chodan, who is a youth delegate with the Bhutanese delegation, and we're honored to have you here. So please go ahead, also as the voice of youth.
Thank you, Pam. My name is Namgai Chodan. Good afternoon to everyone. I was asked to speak on the topic of a new net zero development pathway in the context of my country, Bhutan, with a population of 700,000 people currently. So I thought long and hard about what facts and figures I should bring to the conversation, but instead I settled on telling a story, a frank one, that is, of the complex futures of my country's climate ambitions and our people's ambitions in the face of climate change. Let me begin with a personal story, and then I'll move on to our societal scenario. The man-made climate catastrophe has been an existential threat to me since I was a child. I'm from a place called Panaka, a region that is at a huge risk of GLOFs, glacial lake outbursts, due to the melting of glaciers upstream. And I witnessed a flood in my own lifetime that gave me a startling reality check of the disruptions that climate catastrophes can cause. And I'm afraid that these events will be more likely and more frequent with climate change. What is even more striking is that Bhutan, a carbon-negative country that has championed the environment, is among the least developed countries that contribute the least to carbon emissions, but are also the most vulnerable and the least equipped to address the worst impacts of climate change. My journey in the climate sector has fostered an immense appreciation for my country's efforts to be a responsible member of the international community and for humanity, really, by being a net carbon sequestering country. We are an example, along with the many other small developing countries that have followed suit. But there is a lot that Bhutan needs to do and can do. Currently, Bhutan faces the challenges to green our growing cities, as well as achieving our economic aspirations, meeting our energy needs in a sustainable manner. Relevant to our organizers here today, preserving the cryosphere is of utmost importance to Bhutan as a country existing in the fragile mountain ecosystem of the high Himalayas. We are rapidly losing our glaciers, and that will not only impact our water security, and in relation to that, our food security. Echoing Isabella, Bhutan is a real place where floods due to GLOFs will pose a huge risk to our forests and biodiversity, infrastructure, people, and the economy. Bhutan is also highly reliant on hydropower and agriculture, two of the most vulnerable sectors to climate change, closely related to the stability of the cryosphere. The implementation of Bhutan's LT-LEDs necessitates an estimated USD 3.5 billion in funding, and we have been able to access or receive a little under 200 million from the various climate finance facilities and sources. More will be required for scientific research to resettle affected people in early warning systems and various mitigation efforts. These are very real challenges that we face. It is truly a huge task for countries like Bhutan within the UNFCCC regime to achieve these goals. I'm here today as a young person in the midst of power politics and a massive bureaucracy to navigate in order to advocate for my country's very existence. I'm also here today for the rest of us who cannot be here. In particular, the young in Bhutan, the largest population in my country currently that is under the age of 29, whose voices and efforts count hugely towards our endeavor to remain carbon neutral perpetually. I come here today with a demand for justice, truth, and science, for it takes tremendous courage and stamina for the least developed of us to be in these spaces. Bhutan's constitution mandates that every Bhutanese is a steward of the environment. However, there are larger factors, such as increasing global emissions and inaction as a global community, that will make it increasingly difficult for Bhutan to remain carbon negative. Well, I was asked to end on a note of hope. The world needs Bhutan as an inspiration, a source of optimism, of how a small country with so little at its disposal became an environmental champion. But Bhutan also needs the world, for its future depends on our collective ambition and action to avert the worst impacts of climate change that will in turn most definitely impact Bhutan. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we have time for a few questions or comments before closing. Kuban.
Thank you, Pam. Good afternoon. My name is Kuban. I'm a delegate from Kyrgyzstan. So I want to thank all of the panelists for wonderful presentations. So I have a brief comment and one question. I commend, Isabella, your study on Hindu Kush and Himalaya. And I also commend Nakbai for presenting us what Bhutan faces. What you said is very common what we experience in Kyrgyzstan. So I wish that your study also embraced Tanshan, where Kyrgyzstan is located. So maybe your next task will be exploring Tanshan and challenges that the Central Asia is facing. My question is to Ambassador Fuller. In Sharm el-Sheikh, parties talked about, for the first time, about the concept swapping debt for nature preservation on the example of Seychelles Mountains. Would you be able to briefly comment on the prospects of this initiative, how this initiative can be realized as a financial mechanism? Thank you.
Any more questions before we, yeah.
It's more a comment, really. I mean, somebody spoke about the importance of raising awareness of these issues, and in addition to the mitigation and the adaptation work programs from COP26, there's also one called for something called Action for Climate Empowerment, which people often think is about young people and about schools, which that is certainly part of it, but is not all of it. It's much more, it's also about just transition, about training, about public participation. It's a really big agenda. And then so there's a workshop this afternoon in the big New York room at 3 till 6, and there'll be another workshop tomorrow, which is about monitoring, evaluation and reporting. So if anyone is interested and wants to take this forward, it'd be great to see some of you there. So thank you.
One more question, perhaps? Okay, we'll give our panel a chance to respond. Simply turn on your microphone if you have any comments. Yeah, Carlos, obviously.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed for the question. So Belize is a big proponent of nature-based solutions. It was a year or two ago, we actually signed a blue bond and allowed us to cut our foreign debt by 50% while saving over 30% of our marine area. And in fact, we will achieve the 30 by 30 by 2026 of actually securing that part. So indeed, it is a big gain for us, not only to address climate change, but of course also biodiversity. In addition, we have over 60% of our land is actually under forest cover, and we will continue to conserve that. So again, we will certainly, support that whole area, and we want to use Belize as a sort of an example of what can be done in other sectors where we can use nature-based solutions to address it, because nature knows what to do. It just needs a helping hand to do it. So we will certainly support all attempts indeed to use both land and sea to address climate change and also biodiversity loss, really strengthening the outcomes of the CBD COP15 held in Montreal last year.
Any other comments? Okay, I'd like to thank our panel and to provide some concluding remarks then. Eduardo Silva is one of the two co-chairs of AMI, along with Iceland. You can see the country list here, which includes, for example, Kyrgyzstan. And we hope more countries really willing to raise this very important aspect of climate change to higher levels. So, Eduardo, please.
Thank you, Pam, and good afternoon to all of you. And first of all, I would like to thank for the. First of all, I would like to apologize for my delay to join this side event. But most importantly, I would like to thank about the wonderful presentations, especially the sense of hope from the Bhutan experience. Also the wisdom of Carlos, that is always very valuable. practical inputs and ideas about how we can incorporate this agenda in the mitigation work program. Also the ICIMOD declaration that I hope many countries, including my country, Chile, will join it. And to our friend Joanna, we have a friend in the Secretariat about our agenda. That is also very good, always very good. And as you probably know, AMI is an informal group that was created during COP27. This group is very diverse. It's not only a group that the members of the groups have a presence in the cryosphere regions, I mean Antarctica, Arctic, or mid-latitude glaciers. Also, the members are countries that are strongly affected about what is happening in the cryosphere because of consequences like sea level rise, effects in the reserves of water resources. It means the cryosphere is something that is meaningful and important for all the countries of the international community because what is happening there affects each of them. The main message of this group and the main idea is, at the end, to increase ambition, because keeping 1.5 on the reach is the way that we can prevent these irreversible effects in the cryosphere regions, and also to prevent to cross the thresholds or the tipping points that will accelerate the processes in those areas with catastrophic consequences. It means ambition, ambition, and ambition. Keeping 1.5 is the way to avoid those consequences, and this is our first objective and target. And we would like to promote this agenda to make the political leaders understand the severe threat, and also to impact or have influence in the negotiations. And there are a lot of scientific evidence with the time is more accurate, and there is more data and research elements that provide us a clear picture about effects like the collapse of ice sheets in the Antarctic region, the melting process in Greenland, the acidification of the polar oceans, the retreat of the mountain glaciers, among others, and how these processes, these effects of the climate change are affecting sea level rise, water resources, ecosystems in the polar oceans, and also how affect local communities in mountain regions and other regions where the cryosphere is present. And we have two main ways to create this awareness and have influence in the process. One is at the political level, and the other one, we would like to organize events, promote that more countries join the declaration and join this group, but also we would like to have incidents in the negotiation process in each of the tracks where we identify that there is an entry point to include this agenda. And most of them have been mentioned here. One of them, mitigation work program, research and systematic observation, loss and damage. But one of the most important one during this COP is the GST process. And in that sense, we need to join forces, the countries of this group, and also non-party stakeholders and other countries that still are not members, to bring the agenda of the GST in each of the outcomes of the GST process. For example, the summary report of the technical dialogues. We are now at the end of the technical process, and we are starting the political phase of the GST. And we need to be very active to promote that in the summary reports of these technical dialogues, cryosphere agenda is incorporated. Also in the decision of the outcomes of the GST, and probably we hope that, and from the point of view of Chile, of the political declaration from the GST and the high-level events that will take place during COP28. We also believe that there is a space and there is an opportunity to include this agenda in the cover decision of COP28. We have the experience of the COP27 decision. For the first time in a decision was identify the issue of tipping points associated with a cryosphere. This is a good start point, and we believe that we can introduce new elements in the cover decision related with thresholds, tipping points, and elements related with Cryosphere. And I would like to end to encouraging all of you, non-party stakeholders and scientists, representatives of the countries, to raise the voice and to influence in each of your own positions in a way that this agenda is incorporated at the political levels, at the scientific level, but and also in the negotiation process. And we are happy to discuss with any of you if you want to have more information about what we are doing in AMI and how we can promote the incorporation of all the countries. Thank you.
So thank you for coming. This concludes our formal program. The food, as I understand, is still being set up outside. We started a bit late because the side event before us started late, but we're going to end on time. But if you will gather outside the door, you don't need to rush away immediately, then you'll be able to have just a little bit of lunch before continuing on with your busy days. So thank you again for your attendance and your attention. And we will see you in the hallways. Thanks so much.